Hi class, here is a second part of our conversation on language presentation, diversity, and cultural work. In part one, we looked at some common language around what is a language community, what are some definitions of language, culture, and some other concepts. And looked at some of kind of a macro level viewpoint from recognizing language being quite diverse throughout the world in the recent history, if you went back just a couple hundred years, and then seeing that a variety of processes have contributed to a dramatic loss in that language diversity and increase in endangerment. And these processes are everywhere from forced to, like Old English, just general passing of time that has changed the makeup of that language diversity. And we've looked at how some of the rationale for preservation has relates to both cultural sustainability as a discipline, and ways that this work relates directly to how the continuity of cultural traditions, and also how the work of language preservation is has unique implications for cultural sovereignty, particularly in North America and the United States, where tribes have some very specific treaty-based requirements for how they maintain their access to rights, resources, and territory. And so, but there are a range of other reasons that we see preservation achieved and pursued. And the first one we're going to start with is academic research. So academic research is both something that gets brushed aside because oftentimes language communities may feel that a linguist coming in and doing research and then going back and writing a theoretical paper on some obtuse aspect of grammar and doesn't really benefit their language and their pressing need for revitalization. And that may be true, but I think it's important to recognize that work in language does not happen in a vacuum of time or resources and money. So if the majority of work that is happening around language documentation and revitalization is occurring in the context of academic relationships. And so whether those are big archives, big documentation projects, publishing, other efforts, often has some overlap with the academic world. And in the academic world, to free up the time, the graduate students, the undergrads, the grant resources, faculty have to be able to publish, they have to be able to write these grants, they have to be able to show theoretical inquiry, and a variety of other constraints. And so, yes, there is certainly a history of linguistics ignoring the needs of individual communities and instead focusing on these theoretical questions. There are history of anthropologists coming and conducting extractive research, unethical research, publishing materials in ways that are not beneficial to a community, sharing information in ways that aren't beneficial. But there are some important benefits as well. And so for many endangered languages, if they've experienced a very high level of language shift, they're maybe in a position where those languages would not be able to have any chance of revitalization if documentation had not been done by past academics and researchers. So the Mia language is, in Ohio is one example. That language went into complete dormancy. There were no people who knew how to speak it. There are no audio recordings of that language, and so no one even knew what it would sound like. But because there was textual documentation of the language, it has been reconstructed. And it is an example of a viable language revitalization effort today. So whether it's linguistics, studying syntax, or historical comparative linguistics, or phonetics, anthropologists studying a variety of cultural processes related to language, if it's science, hard sciences, studying traditional ecological knowledge, relevancy for medicine or other practices, there are lots of overlaps between academic research and the needs of communities. They don't always overlap 100%, and it's important that academics are respectful of their outsider status when coming into a community, and being cognizant of those community privacy concerns, those community concerns for ownership, and wanting to build up local capacity, not just conduct extractive research. Loss of diversity has many implications, and we've already discussed a few, but I'm going to go over those, a couple in a little bit more detail. Knowledge transmission is certainly one aspect of loss. When we lose information, then we have decreased ability to transmit that information, whether that's information about genealogies or histories or oral tradition or songs and stories or other political and legal structures. All the transmission of all that knowledge can be in jeopardy if those speakers of a language are not around anymore, have not documented that information, and it has not been translated into other widely known languages. And so, certainly for cultural sustainability and anthropology, those are some major concerns. I'll refer to the Harrison text a couple times. We're reading at least one chapter of it, and he will go into importance of knowledge transmission as it relates to several of these different categories. Next is ways of speaking, and Harrison again looks at some of how our changing speech has resulted in reduced vocabulary. So if a community is very involved in reindeer herding or some other practice, and they become they may have hundreds of words for different aspects of reindeer, herding and feeding and carrying and birthing and all sorts of things. Just like in the Pacific Northwest, where you have cultures that were heavily reliant on canoe travel and water travel. There are many words for describing tides and flows and currents and all sorts of pieces of information that describe something very practical and very tangible and very important to your culture, to your survival. Not just of how a culture survives, but how you as a person or your family survives. And so when we see those changes, both change in cultural makeup and change in use availability of language, we might lose those unique ways of describing the world. And once those are lost, they can, if they're not documented, they can never be retrieved. And language has a variety of unique mechanisms for packaging that. whether it's engendered speech or affixes or prefixes, things that describe sense of time and place and smell or location. Those can all be packaged up and captured within language. Just a very easy example is when you have a language that is descriptive. So if you have something like poison ivy as a name that describes something about that plant, as opposed to, say, just calling something a Douglas fir tree. Well, a Douglas fir tree doesn't really denote much important information about the use of that tree, its safety, or anything else. But the term poison ivy, that tells us something pretty clear. And in many native languages, that is just built in, hardwired into how speech is used, particularly for non-literate cultures that relied on orality to communicate information. That packaging of information within speech to convey meaning and knowledge was really critical. Again, direct environmental connections for thinking about how language can be descriptive. Place names are another good example. In the U.S., we may call something by a name, whether it's the name of a city or the name of a mountain, and that name may convey information, and it really may not. It may just sound nice, but more often than not, in many native languages, they will, especially for those ones that come from oral cultures, there's going to be a high level of information that tells the history of a place, its who lived there, or other types of information that is really interesting and is packaged up in that name that communicates far more than just something that might sound nice. Native science is, again, a way that we're able to see the connections between language and other academic study. Harrison describes an example from a community called Musqueam that's in lower British Columbia. That is actually the closest community to the University of British Columbia, where I did my PhD. And there's an example from them about the classification of trout and salmon. The Musqueam people always knew that trout and salmon were the same species. They were salmon. There was no word for trout. They were always called salmon. Westerners came in, they looked at salmon, and they said that was one type of fish, and trout, well, it had a different life cycle, so they called it trout. But through genetic analysis, scientists just rediscovered that trout are actually, in the Pacific Northwest, salmon species. And so it affirmed this piece of knowledge that was always communicated in Coast Salish culture and reflected in their language for how they describe both of those species. And so when I took Musqueam language classes in a joint project between the Musqueam First Nation and the University of British Columbia, that was something that the elders there repeated and communicated, and were quite proud of, that they always had that knowledge and the correct grouping of classification for those different fish, those different types of salmon. Another area that we'll see connections between for rationale for preservation of language is around biocultural connections. It's not a coincidence that many times we see language endangerment, cultural endangerment, and environmental endangerment in the same location. So to take the Amazon rainforest, for example, we've got a habitat that is in danger of deforestation and logging and all sorts of things. Within that ecosystem, we have lots of plants and animals that are endemic and unique there and are not found anywhere else, and are also become endangered. Endangered species and endangered habitat, they garner lots of international attention. They garner huge amounts of money and advocacy around. If you look at the amount of money spent on habitat and species restoration or endangerment, it far exceeds what we see in the realm of cultural endangerment and sustainability. I recently went to 2 different fundraisers in the community I live in, one for a land trust that works in preserving habitat, and another land trust that works on affordable housing. They're both land trusts. They will have similar models, but different missions. And just like we see on the global scale, there's much more money and attention for habitat and often animals. We see less money for people and culture, and that was it was about not almost 10 times the amount of money raised when we were at a fundraiser for habitat compared to one for affordable housing. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a level of importance that is different, but people are more willing to create advocacy around different areas. And so sometimes we'll find connections made between wanting to co-preserve 2 different things at the same time, and maybe build some efficiencies there and piggyback on top of 2 different types of advocacy work and activism. And that can be done well. It has had some not so good situations as well. We'll do some other reading on that, but I think what's important is that we are recognizing when our communities really being advocated for, or are they just being used to advocate for a different cause? And it's always important to remember that we don't want to replicate colonial mentalities, processes of disempowerment and essentialization of people or communities, even if it's at the expense of trying to save a unique species. And I recommend this Decolonizing Methodologies as a great text to kind of think through how decolonization can be part of your practice of research and methodological scrutiny. And finally, linguistic rights. There is a history of work around linguistic rights, but unfortunately not a lot of strong legs to stand on for, especially in comparison to something like the Endangered Species Act or global treaties and protocol around trafficking of endangered species and things like that. So it's not necessarily without trying. There is roots to the connection of language as being part of human rights that goes back as far as 1948, but as recently as 1990, there have been lots of efforts to elevate linguistic rights to the level of international law. We saw in 1996 a declaration, but that was not ratified by very many organizations. And we saw a European charter in support of minority languages and regional languages in 1992, which has certainly provided some directions for work in the European continent, but again, that is somewhat limited. We've also have the the UNESCO, which is the UN Educational, Science, and Cultural Organization, has an initiative on endangered languages that provides some funding and education, but again, no legal protection. So certainly an area to look at and to try and work from, to use as some basis for the rationale for preservation, but not a whole lot of teeth to actually go out and find legally binding rules here. So there's some overview of connections between various cultural processes and practices and how we are able to articulate rationale for preservation. Thank you for listening.